Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Aliens in the Empire, Diversity in the American Colonies, an online professional development seminar from America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm, I'm Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating the session this evening. Before we get underway, let me take a minute to introduce the National Humanities Center. We're located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We're the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. What does that mean? Well, that means, first of all, we're independent. We're a private nonprofit organization. We're an institute for advanced study, which means that the main program we offer here is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center for an academic year to research and write books and articles in the humanities: history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We opened in 1978. Since then, 13 scholars have researched here, and about 13 books have been published as a result of that research. The place may look like an ivory tower, but it's really not. We want to reach a wide array of audiences, and we're particularly interested in reaching teachers. We do that through these online seminars. We also do it by providing primary resources, lessons, and secondary sources. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've brought all of those resources together in what we are now calling America in Class from the National Humanities Center. You can learn all about that by going to americainclass.org, and that site will give you access to all of our resources. But I want to tell you about a new one that we just created, America in Class Lessons. These are lessons based on primary documents. They follow the new core state standards. They begin with a framing question and move you to an essential understanding. They provide online access to a single text or a small number of texts. We provide a background essay to allow you to teach the text with confidence, and then we provide you some advice on precisely how to do that. We have mined key excerpts from the text and given you discussion questions so that you can flash these up on a screen or assign them to your students, and they can follow along in class discussion. We also provide, in some cases, follow-up assignments. Now, we have 8 lessons up right now. As you see, they run from early visual representations of the New World to failed European colonies, and also to the cult of domesticity. Now, when you go to an America in Class page, you're going to see this little icon right there. We urge you to click on that, because when you click on that, that will take you to this page. And here you will be able to order a free poster from us. The poster we call Picturing Monopoly. It is actually the image of the Curse of California, a political cartoon that appeared in a publication called The Wasp in August of 1882. It's a wonderful image for teaching monopolistic business practices in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The image is carefully annotated. It makes a wonderful thing for you to put up in your classroom. And on the back of it, you will find out about America in Class. You learn about all the things we offer and how to access them. So please click on that icon and let us send you a free poster picturing Monopoly. I think it'll be a great addition to your classroom. Now, let me remind you that after the seminar, the recording of the seminar will be available on the Aliens in the Empire website, the website through which you obtain your readings. You will also find here the PowerPoint for the seminar and also an evaluation. We ask you please to complete the evaluation. You can do it online and submit it to us. It's very important to us. We do pay attention to what you tell us on the evaluations. Once we've received your evaluation, we will mail you documentation of participation. This is a letter that you can present to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in the seminar warrants. Now, let me explain how the seminar will work tonight. It'll be a lecture keyed to a presentation of slides with text excerpts that illustrate some important points. We will stop from time to time to analyze the excerpts through discussion. Others will not. We'll just point some things out about them and move along. Now, here's how you can participate. If you want to raise your hand and speak up, you can click on the little hand-raised icon there. I will see it, and at an appropriate moment, I will pass the microphone to you. Or you can chat. Put your cursor in the little box down the lower right-hand side of your screen, type in your message, click send, and your message will appear up here in the larger chat box. So those are the 2 ways you can participate, and really the seminars work best when we have a lot of participation, so we encourage you to participate this evening. Are there any questions before we get underway? If there are no questions, flash me a smiley face so I'll know that we're all ready to go. Okay, we have a few of their smiley faces coming in. All right, that always warms my heart. Okay, great. So let's get underway, ladies and gentlemen, with Aliens in the Empire. We're going to be looking at diversity in the American colonies. We have two simple goals. We want to deepen understanding of the diverse mix of people who populated colonial America, and we want to provide you with some fresh resources and instructional approaches for you to use with your students. Now, we had a pretty good discussion of this topic in the forum. We had a number of questions. Who was here? That kept coming up over and over again. What groups made up the racial, ethnic, and religious diversity of the colonies? How did the different groups that populated the colonies get along? How did they relate to the British? And how did the British relate to them? How much religious diversity existed in the colonies? To what side, patriot or loyalist, did the various ethnic groups in the colonies gravitate as the revolution approached? To what extent did the diversity of colonial America contribute to the development of a distinctive American culture? And finally, what contributions did the various ethnic and religious groups make to the culture of the colonies? To lead us through those questions tonight, we're very pleased to have with us Kathleen A. DuVal, who's Associate Professor of Undergraduate Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She was a National Humanities Center Fellow in 2008 and 9. She has published The Native Ground, Indians and Colonists in the Heart of the Continent in 2006, and in 2009, she co-edited with her father, Interpreting a Continent, Voices from Colonial America. So let me now turn the program over to Kathleen, and she will tell us all about diversity in the American colonies. Kathleen, it is all yours.
Thank you, Richard. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for your participation in the forum. It's been really nice to read those questions as they come in. As Richard said, we're going to be talking about diversity in the American colonies and aliens in the American colonies. We'll be talking about a large number of people, different kinds of people, the English, of course, but also the Dutch, Germans, Scots-Irish, Africans, various Native Americans, and the French and the Spanish. At the core, I think, of this seminar is the question of what does alien mean? Because alien is the kind of word that doesn't have meaning by itself. It has meaning only in relationship to other people. Who do you think is an alien? And what does that mean about yourself? And what does that mean about what you think about others? So as we move forward, let me start with a map just to get our bearings. This is a map made in 1763. It proclaims itself, the map maker proclaims that it is a new map of North America from the latest discoveries, but in 1763 it was moments away from being an old map, because in 1763 the powers that had been fighting the 7 Years' War finally came to peace and divided up things quite differently from on this map. So what this map really shows us is what things were like before the end of the 7 Years' War, who claimed what. So as you can see here, the red part is British territory, basically the 13 colonies, and a little bit of what eventually became Canada after the Revolution. The large green swath was green territory. The large green swath was French territory. And the small bit of yellow that you can see at the bottom was Spanish. If it were a map of the whole continent, there'd be a lot more yellow because the Spanish claimed most of the lands west of the Mississippi. Now, underneath these colors, most of these lands beyond the Atlantic coast, where most of the British settlement was, were actually controlled and owned by Indians rather than by the British, the Spanish, or the French. So in 1763, the 7 Years' War ended, as you know, and these colors shifted around. Most of what shows on this map became British, or at least British in the eyes of Europeans, not necessarily in the eyes of Indians. The British gained all of these lands on this map that are green. France lost the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and was expelled from North America. And while Spain held on to a lot of the West, this bit of Florida, you can see that the yellow here, became British as well.
Kathleen, we have a few questions already.
Sure. Yeah.
First of all, we have a question here about the word alien. did that have negative connotations back then, or was it even used back then?
Well, the inspiration for the title of the seminar comes from a quotation from Benjamin Franklin, where he used the word alien. And as you'll see when we get to it, he does, or if you've already read it, he does not mean it kindly. So, I mean, there isn't the notion of an illegal alien the way we have we hear thrown around today. So it's not negative. I think I would argue it's not negative to the extent that it is today, but it's not good either in the 1700s.
Okay, we have another question about the German language. How widespread was the use of German in the colonies at the time? Our questioner talks about a myth of German being a dominant language in early America.
Well, yeah, dominant. I absolutely dominant would be a stretch. Certainly not dominant. We'll talk a little bit later about numbers of German immigrants. There were a lot who came, and they did tend to continue to speak German because many of them immigrated with their families or stayed with small communities at the same time that they might learn English as well, but certainly not dominant.
Okay, and the Hudson Bay area in New York, was that
right, you're right. You can see that is the pink ring around the top. I forgot to mention that. That's right. Most of Canada was French or not belonging to any Europeans. But yes, you can see the bottom of the Hudson Bay area there is marked on the map, and all around the Hudson Bay was British. Yes, exactly right. Okay,
good. Well, shall we move ahead then?
Yes, and if you want to bring me back to any of those later questions, like the Alien and Sedition Act that will come up or after the Revolution, we can try to remember to get back to those. So if you ask that, keep it in mind, and we'll talk about it as we go
Okay.
along.
All right.
So the end of the 7 Years' War meant that new territories were being incorporated into the British colonies, territories with many more Indians in them, and with French, with a few Spanish, although the Spanish hadn't actually persuaded many colonists to come to their North American colonies, their colonies north of Mexico. And also an end to the war that had lasted 7 or so years meant immigration could increase again. Immigration tends to die down in wartime and to rise back up in American history after the end of the wars. So the years after 1763 meant the British colonies were adding more and more aliens, if you will, or new people, to a growing population. And this led to a rapid population growth. Just to give you a couple of figures, in 1700 there were about 250,000 colonists in the British colonies. So in 1700, about 250,000 colonists in British colonies. By 1770, there were over 2 million. It was huge growth. And they were less English than they had been before. Just a quick overview of 18th century immigration. Those are big numbers. A little over a third of immigrants in the 18th century, immigrants to the British colonies, were Scotch-Irish. About a third were African. Of course, they were involuntary immigrants, almost all of them. About 15% came from the German principalities, various German states. Germany wasn't a country yet, as you probably know, but came from the German states. About 10% from Scotland directly, and less than 10% from England. By 1770, therefore, only about half of the colonists were of English descent. This next map shows you ethnic diversity in the American colonies. Gives you a broad overview of what the populations were of the different British colonies in the 1750s. I'm going to open this up now to either comments about the map or questions if Richard wants to bring them in. But my question to you is, what sorts of trends do you see in this map? What would you say about this map as far as population and ethnic diversity go?
Okay, while people are contemplating that, we have a question here. What part of the original colonies were originally British, not really Dutch and German? Now, of course, the Germans, or rather the Dutch, were originally in New York. So New York was originally Dutch, right?
Right, right.
Okay, so what part of the colonies were originally British? And were there any areas that were originally and exclusively at one time German?
I don't think there were any that were exclusively German. I think Germans tended to be immigrants to other countries' colonies. Not only the British colonies, though, also the Spanish and French, maybe the French, but definitely the Spanish colonies. if we had shown you a map of the whole continent, I think you get a better sense of how little of the area was British. The vast middle, of course, was controlled by various Native American groups. But as far as claims go, the Spanish had much larger claims to the area, to the continent, because their colonies of Texas and eventually California and New Mexico, the oldest, and Florida, took up most of the continent. Then the French, most of what became the United States, and then the French claimed most of Canada by the 1750s, with the exception of Hudson's Bay and Nova Scotia. So the British colonies really sort of hugged the Atlantic, but their population was larger than that of any of the other European colonies, and they were growing much more rapidly, in part due to immigration.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question about religious diversity too, but I'd like to postpone that because we're going to be talking about that in greater detail later on. So let me scroll through here and see if there's anything else that needs to be brought in. We have another question about religion. Again, we'll postpone that. Okay, also a question here about Native Americans. Where were they in all this? They would pretty much be all over, and we can see some of the Native American tribe names are in there. Like in Georgia, you see the Creek, and in North Carolina, the Cherokee, and the Shawnee, and the Mingo as you go up the coast. So would it be safe to say that throughout this entire area, you had Native Americans?
That's right. In fact, whatever the map maker chose particular Native American groups to put on here to show that they were there, but it's almost random which ones they chose. I mean, these are all fairly large and important groups. But they would completely have crowded out the map if the map maker had tried to write the name of every tribe that was there. Now, by the 1750s, the native population of the part that's colored in, the colonies that are populated by the British and immigrants to the British colonies, that Indian population has shrunk pretty small, although were still certainly Indian nations living within there, such as the Catawbas in the Carolinas. But all this area that is white on the map, that implies that it's just blank, was not only populated by various American Indian groups, but controlled by them. They still had sovereign nations.
Mm-hmm. And again, just to clarify this map, the African population, those are the folks with those are designated by the stripes. So again, they are throughout the colonies, right? Yeah.
Well, there's actually the slightly darker purple. So where they're striped, as you can see in the Carolinas and most of Virginia and Maryland and Delaware, that's showing you that roughly the population of African and English. They're both they're the largest two groups, and the African population is large enough that even if it's not half the population, it's close enough to half that they wanted to make a stripe instead of make it all light pink for English. But the light pink in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, that shows that it's majority English.
Okay.
But the participant who mentions that the trend of there being Africans sort of throughout the colonies is right. You can't see it in the very north. But of course they are there too.
Okay, we have a question again about Native Americans, about depopulation of Indians from diseases along the coast. Now this map in 1750, by that time, how are the colonists and the Native Americans getting along? Have we begun at this point to really move the Native Americans aside, and have disease and so forth taken their toll by 1750?
Yeah, most the epidemics, it's sort of unclear what because it's hard to get evidence from the very early periods of the 1500s, say, of how much of an effect epidemics had. We don't have exact numbers or anything close to exact numbers, but diseases had already made serious inroads into the native population. Some people say between 1492 and this map in the 1750s, perhaps native populations across the continent had declined by 90%. That's sort of a high estimate, and that's over 2+ centuries, but still very dramatic. But still, millions of Indians living in North America. Fewer of them, I say, in the British colonies, a lower percentage of them in the British colonies than anywhere else.
Okay, good. Well, shall we move on then?
Yeah, let me just address, one person pointed out that there seem to be fewer Native Americans in the South on this map, and And that is what this looks like, but that's only because the mapmaker has decided to spell out all the names of the Iroquois Confederacy tribes up there. I'm not sure why the mapmaker did that, because it's actually not true. If you could throw in Chickasaws and Choctaws and many other Indians in the South and make it look more even. Just sort of random.
So one question here for clarification about disease. The greatest disease, the disease that wiped out the greatest number of Indians was smallpox. Is that fair to say?
I think that's the best guess. But even things like chickenpox that we as not being deadly were deadly before antibiotics and to a population that hadn't been exposed to them. Of course, by the 1750s, most Native Americans had been exposed to smallpox and other diseases, but there would be an awful smallpox outbreak during the Revolution that is probably the best documented of the epidemic outbreaks. And so we certainly can say that killed a tremendous number of people. But some of that is just an artifact of what kinds of sources we have.
Okay. Well, let's move ahead then.
Okay. So let's see where we are. Some people, okay, thank you. Some people, as many Americans, as they sort of looked at how these changes were happening, how more immigrants were coming, and how the internal population was growing, could sort of see changes on the horizon, and took it upon themselves to advise what should be done about them. Now, William Clark was a Bostonian, and he wrote what he thought should be done, particularly about the French, to the Royal Governor of Massachusetts. And he published his think piece as a pamphlet in 1755. So he wrote during the 7 Years' War. So let me read this passage. The number of inhabitants within all the British colonies in North America may be expected from their natural increase, and without making any allowance for the transplanting of Protestant families from Germany, to amount at the end of 30 years to near 3 million. So at the time he's writing, the British colonies are perhaps 1.5 million. England itself is probably 6.5 million. So he's saying British colonies are going to grow to perhaps near 3 million at the end of another 30 years. So the question here is, why does Clark think the British colonies are growing?
Okay, there's a question on the table. Why does William Clark think the British colonies are growing? Opportunities and, of course, land. First response.
Right. Yeah.
What else?
So, compared to the places that he's talking about, Britain, Germany, it's possible to at least dream that you might someday own your own land.
Okay.
And for some people, that was a reality.
Okay. Better nutrition for families to survive.
Right.
Farming.
Right. Yeah. Farming and the opportunity to earn your own living. To buy those, buy food.
No, he also thinks too that natural increase is going to do the trick. Right.
So we've been talking about the main subject of our class today is immigration, but he's going to natural increase too. He's saying even without immigration, the colonies are going to grow and perhaps double in the next 30 years. Yes, birth rates up, infant mortality down.
Okay, we're getting people are coming back now to a lot of the same things about hopefulness and opportunities and food and land.
And when you have those things, you're thinking about more children, marrying early.
Yeah, you can have more education. Right. We have a question here about education, which I think we'll get to later on too. Okay. So, shall we move ahead then?
Yes, please. Okay. So another passage from William Clark. He says, the advantage accruing to the mother country from the great number of inhabitants in her northern colonies will appear from the consumption they will occasion of British manufactures and also of all other European commodities in general, which must be landed and reshipped in Great Britain before they can be imported into America. So what is Clark saying is the benefit of colonies to the empire?
Okay. How do these colonies benefit Great Britain? Income, yep.
Yes, that's right, exactly. So income directly from consuming British products. And then what does he mean by products needing to be landed and reshipped in Great Britain by the Act of Trade? What's he talking about there? Anybody know what that is?
Anybody? My sense of revolutionary history. These are some of the navigation acts.
Exactly. Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah.
Right. You all probably teach those when you teach the revolution. Yeah. So here's usually we talk about the navigation acts from a negative perspective, that the colonists don't like them. Here he's saying this is the reason why Great Britain should value the colonists. They not only their direct consumption, but the products that have to be landed and reshipped in Great Britain.
We have a comment here. A participant says that he never understood how the colonists could afford British products in the closed mercantilist system. Isn't it true that the British colony, the American colonies, were pretty affluent? I mean, they had a pretty good deal, didn't they?
That's right, and they also, as Thomas Jefferson might have admitted, they had access to credit. Because they were producing things that were valuable to the empire. So often they were buying consumer goods on credit. Jefferson ended up in a great deal of debt because of it.
Yeah, well, the British soldiers who came over to fight the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, they went back to England realizing that the American colonists were doing pretty well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
So they were able to pay those taxes to pay for the war, right?
Exactly. That's what the British thought for sure.
Yeah, I know. We should have looked cool.
They also thought they didn't fight very hard.
Well, that may be true too. I don't know. Anyway, shall we move ahead then?
Sure. Okay, so then this is Clark's big point he's building up to here. If France somehow were able to get control of the British colonies, then the trade and commerce of France, and with it France's naval power, would increase to such a degree of superiority over that of Great Britain as must entirely destroy Britain's commerce, reduce her from her present state of independency to be at last nothing more than a province of France. So what's the threat here?
Uh-oh. The French.
The French.
What's the threat here? Yeah. What do the French pose? What threat do they pose? Any takers on that question?
Pesky frogs. Yes,
Pesky
indeed.
frogs.
Yes, indeed.
That's
And
the
they're
British
French fries.
Yeah.
Yes, just this reflection of Gallo versus Anglo rivalry that's found across history, or certainly across the early modern and modern era, since there have been an England and a France. So yes, the worst thing he can threaten England with is becoming a province of France.
Yeah.
So what would you say Clark's main point overall here is, and who fits in as English, who's British, and who's not? And in other words, what does he see as alien and what's not?
And what is, in Clark's view, what's alien, what's not alien?
While you think about that, I see someone has said he fears that France gaining control here would give France an edge in terms of worldwide imperialism and naval capacity. That's right. He's arguing that France will start here in the colonies and then will take over the world.
Well, in response to your question, definitely the French are not British. That is for sure.
Right.
They're aliens.
There we go. The French are aliens. Right, exactly.
I'm not sure, but would he say just about everybody other than the French would be British?
Yeah, I think Clark has a pretty generous view of who's British, who, if you're contributing to the British Empire and if you're against France, then you're with us, and it's all good.
Okay, so we're starting out here. To go back to our points earlier in the seminar about how this seminar is really going to be about the definition of alien. Now we're starting out with a very broad view of alien. As long as you're not French, you're not an alien. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good. So shall we move on then?
Yes, great. So to wrap up Clark, who's sort of setting up our discussion here, you know what's going to happen next, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution. So what might you say Clark had right, or what did he have wrong?
Okay, what did he have right and wrong? Well, let's see. Sounds as if Clark feels as if the French are aliens, but the threat is that French power will result in the British becoming aliens. Well, aliens in their own
Turn the
empire.
table on the aliens. Exactly, that's right. If it's the French Empire, the British are the aliens. That's right.
Yeah. Well, he had right to some extent that the colonies were going to grow by natural increase, but I think he overlooked the immigration, didn't he?
Yeah, I think that's right. He sort of says even without counting immigration, natural increase will do this. So he really isn't thinking as much about immigration. I think there's a nice one of the participants makes the point that the prediction that the French might help the colonists if they happen to rebel against their empire, which of course Clark would have thought impossible, but in another 10 years it starts to look more possible and true. So of course the colonists get the French to help them in their war.
All right. So he had some things right and some things wrong. Okay. Shall we move on then?
Yeah, okay. Okay, so now we move to Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was born in Massachusetts and worked for his brother's Boston paper. He had a dispute with his brother over his own indenture. He was indentured for a little bit to his brother. Ran away at 17 to New York, and from there got a job as a printer in Philadelphia, where he spent most of the rest of his life. This piece by Franklin was written before Clark wrote his. He wrote it in 1751, but it was published as an appendix to Clark's observations. So many people read them together and read Franklin's for the first time in conjunction with Clark. And in some ways, Benjamin Franklin agrees with Clark. He certainly agrees with his main message, his main anti-French message. But there's some ways in which he's different too. So let's walk through what Benjamin Franklin has to say. Do you want to read this one, Richard?
Sure. If in Europe they have but 4 births to a marriage, many of their marriages being late, we may here reckon 8, of which if 1/2 grow up, and our marriages are made reckoning one with another at 20 years of age, our people must at least be doubled every 20 years.
So what's Franklin saying about population in the colonies versus in Europe?
Okay, greater birth rate.
Right, right.
Yeah. And I think here, that quote speaks to all of the things that people, younger marriage, which again, speaks to the things that the participants were talking about earlier, more economic opportunity, more land, a more hopeful environment. So here he's agreeing with Clark that it's going to, that the British will dominate in time, and as Clark said, through natural increase.
Right, exactly, yeah. So Franklin continues his logic here. He says, this million doubling, suppose once in 25 years, will in another century be more than the people of England. And the greatest number of Englishmen will be on this side of the water. What an accession to power to the British Empire by sea as well as land. What an increase of trade and navigation. How important an affair then to Britain is the present treaty for setting the bounds between her colonies and the French. And how careful should she be to secure room enough, since on the room depends so much of the increase of her people. So what is Franklin saying is going to happen?
Okay, what is Franklin going to say is going to happen here? Room, more British on the continent than the actual island. Yeah, that was. There's going to be more Brits here in America than in the island, and Britain will be great. Population growth will be better in the British Empire. And also, he's talking about land here. I mean, we're going to, we're bound in between the Atlantic and the Appalachians, but we're going to have more room than that.
Right. And population growth will better the British Empire. Is good.
Yeah.
Now, I think Franklin's logic is a little circular here. He says, because we have land, people can marry early, they feel better about their prospects, therefore they have more children, therefore we'll need more land. So we have more land, circle back to we're going to need more land.
And we have, someone noticed earlier here in the chat that this is already kind of an expression of America's impulse toward Western expansion.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. You're going to have to move west, right?
Yeah.
And north and south.
Yeah. Just a quick digression here that I think is actually important. One of the participants mentioned earlier about made a comment about intermarriage, and he asked if the French intermarried more with the colonists or with other populations than the British. Could you just say a brief word about that? Because I think that does speak to the difference between the French view of colonization and the British view of colonization, and I think that bears upon our seminar on aliens.
That's right. The French did tend to intermarry more often with American Indians than the British did. And sometimes people have romanticized this and said it was because the French were sort of more open to other cultures and such. And I think over time they became a little bit more that way. But I think the main reason was that they just developed very different kinds of empires. The English very quickly became a settlement empire where trade was important. There was still plenty of trade with Indians, and there were intermarriages, particularly between English traders and Indians. But the main thrust of empire was people who came to work their own land. Whereas the French had more difficulty persuading French people to come. They also were trying to persuade them to come to a climate that was much less habitable. Canada was much more reasonable a place to practice the fur trade than to practice a lot of farming, or certainly farming for the market. So you had people who, not only did the French bring larger numbers of higher ratio of men to women, but also many of those men came as traders or as the servants of traders, and just had more interaction with Indians, who tended to be living in Indian towns and such, and more likely to meet Indian women and to have the approval of Indian fathers and mothers of them to marry their daughters.
I see. So the French Empire was based more on direct trade, whereas
Right.
the British was based more on farming, some small manufacturing made for export to the empire.
That's right. That's right. And there was some of all in both kinds of colonies, but just the French Empire was more directed toward trade, and the English Empire more directed toward farming, mostly.
Okay. Well, let's move on then.
Okay. Done that one right. Okay, so Franklin goes on to say, do you want to read this one, Richard?
Sure. Why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion?
So this is the quotation, this is the piece of Franklin's observations here that inspired this seminar, and certainly the title of the seminar. So who is an alien to Franklin?
Okay, who's an alien? And someone writes Palatine with the Hanoverians, King's German. We would say
the English try to forget that very quickly.
yeah. Germans were not considered white. We have some people saying fear of losing status, the dominant German culture. Franklin thinks anyone who is not British, we're back to that again.
Yeah, and possibly anyone who's not English, right?
Right. And then also now we have the issue of complexion being raised here.
Yes, yeah, right.
Yeah. So again, we're seeing if you're not British, in Franklin's view, you're an alien. So now from Clark to Franklin, we're getting a more narrow vision of what an alien is. Would that be fair to say?
Right. That's right. Let's move on and let Franklin speak again, because as he shows us his, I think Richard's put it exactly right, his more narrow view of who's British versus who's an alien. I'm not going to read this whole quotation to you, but basically he's saying, Franklin says, the number of purely white people in the world is proportionably very small. So he says, not Africa, not Asia, not the original Americans, and really not most of Europe either. He says, not the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, Swedes, although to him are not white people. He says they are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also. The Saxons only accepted. So he'll only let the Germans put the Saxons in the population of white people. So he says the Saxons with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. So what's Franklin's argument here? Who is white for him?
Okay. Who would be white for Benjamin Franklin? I think it's the WASP, white English.
That's right. There's definitely no Catholics fall in there, do they?
Yeah. This is a side of Franklin I think we don't see very much, and not the Irish.
Yeah.
That's true.
That's right. And in fact, it's not really the British, right? Because he says English on purpose, I think. It's not the Scots, and it's possibly not the Welsh either. It's only the English. Mm-hmm. I like the wow. Yeah, it's often historians and probably most of you tell our students, don't racism is something that comes a little bit later, earlier on. It's people tended to be more ethnocentric than racist, the way we talk about it in the 20th century. But this, Franklin sounds pretty racist here.
Yeah, he does.
Ahead of his time again, yes,
Yeah.
for better and worse.
Unfortunately. We've got a little less than an hour, Kathleen.
Okay, we better keep moving through here. So he goes on in his quotation he does make one argument in here that we might agree with, which is his racism, I think, leads him in part to saying, why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America? So I'm sure many of you teach about abolition and how it could certainly have its racist side. Here's one. Don't bring Africans to the Americas because we don't want Black people here, Franklin is saying. But that's an anti-slavery argument too, which we would agree with that. So yeah, let's move on because we'll be returning to Franklin.
Okay.
This next section deals with the transition from New Netherland to New York, a place where who was the alien shifted. Clark and Franklin were theorizing, talking about what was best for the empire and what might go wrong with the empire. In this section, we'll be reading some direct observations by people with less of an agenda, I think, although, of course, they have their own biases. Their observations of the diverse city of New York. The Dutch began the trading colony of New Netherland in the early 1600s, mainly centered at New Amsterdam, on the tip of Manhattan, and at Albany, which was a trading post. Mostly, New Netherland was a trading colony. And it was a diverse colony from the beginning. Dutch, of course, but also Germans, French Protestants, Belgians, Scandinavians, Africans, both enslaved and free, and it did have a fairly large population of free blacks as well as slaves. And lots of American Indians, some living in Albany and New Amsterdam, most of them just coming into town for trade. Now, the English began to set their sights on New Netherland for its trade possibilities mostly. It shifted back and forth in various wars in the mid-1600s, and finally the English got New Netherland and changed its name to New York in 1674. Our first author is Sarah Kemble Knight, who wrote a journal of her journey in 1704 and 1705. So she traveled in New York 30 years after the English takeover, so still in the lifetime of a lot of the people that she would have encountered. Knight was born in Boston, and she kept a diary, as I said, of traveling to New York, but it was published long after she traveled, not until after her death. It was published in 1825. Richard, would you like to read this passage from Sarah Kemble Knight?
The English go very fashionable in their dress, but the Dutch, especially the middling sort, differ from our women in their habit, go loose, wear French mouches, which are like a cap and a headband in one, leaving their ears bare, which are set out with jewels of a large size and many in number, and their fingers hooped with rings, some with large stones in them of many colors, as were their pendants in their ears, which you could see very old women wear as well as young.
Right. So what is Knight observing here on her trip to New York? Flashy, yes. And is flashy a good thing? If the Dutch ladies are flashy?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to tell because we don't know what style was. Middle class Dutch do well.
Yeah, bling.
Exactly. The bling, yeah.
Right. She does not approve of the bling.
Yeah, when I read this, I got the impression that she's putting a lot of pressure on the word "but" at the beginning of the second sentence there. English go very fashionable, but those Dutch,
not so fashionable.
It's downhill from there, I think. Yeah, she does not approve of the head not completely covered yet.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So she's noticing difference in customs between English fashion and Dutch. Yeah, and that they dress differently, and that's what she notices. And I think she's you don't see this kind of description all that often in most travel journals are written by men, and Sarah Kemble Knight sees different things.
Okay. So again, we have a definition here of alien. The British, it's their point of view, and the Dutch are alien.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think Knight here is seeing things she's not judgmental in the same way that you might say Franklin was, but she's certainly judgmental in her own way and in a sort of perhaps a more acceptable female way of judging about appearance, judging about style, and certainly judging the Dutch as deficient.
Yeah, and a definite sense of whose colonies these are, you know.
Yeah, that's right. So it's only been English 30 years, but to her, this is an English colony, and the Dutch are the aliens.
Yeah, we have a question here about the words "go loose." I don't think that means go wild. She means maybe wears kind of loose-fitting clothing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Which is a little wild to her, but yeah, not go loose.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move ahead then.
But I think that is a sign of how one of the things she thinks about them. Their clothes are too loose, and that's a sign that they may be loose women.
Okay. All right.
Oops, I'm in the wrong direction.
There we go.
Our next author is Dr. Alexander Hamilton. He gets that honorific of doctor just to distinguish him from Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury and killed by Aaron Burr. This Alexander Hamilton is known only because of his travel journal, quite an engaging travel journal that people have continued to read long since he wrote it. Now, another 40 years have gone past since Knight's account, and now New York is 70 years into English rule. Hamilton gave a very detailed account of his trip from Maryland to New Hampshire and back, and in between, of course, was New York. And like Knight, Hamilton was a sharp observer. And he says in this first passage that we've pulled out, "There have been a great number of Dutch here, though now their language and customs begin pretty much to wear out, and would very soon die if it were not for a parcel of Dutch domies who, in the education of their children, endeavor to preserve the Dutch custom as much as possible." So is Hamilton presenting the Dutch as aliens?
Okay. Hamilton by 1744. When is this, Kathleen?
This is 1744. That's right.
1744. So we have a different of opinion here. We said assimilation to English culture, and then another person says absolutely foreign. So I don't know. He's saying here their language and customs being pretty much to wear out. So yeah, I think we got assimilation going on. What do you think?
Okay. Yeah. What do other people think? Thoughts?
Any other thoughts about this? He frowns at the Dutch trying to keep their own culture alive. Yeah, so the flip side of that is they're trying to keep it alive, which means that they fear that it is fading. Those teachers are...
Right, take those teachers.
And they have to support them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to retain their own culture within the dominant culture, right?
Yeah.
So I think both of these strands are right. Hamilton's saying, oh yeah, class between generations. You can just imagine the kinds of debates that were going on within Dutch households. I want to be like the English. Why do you want me to speak Dutch and such? So I think Hamilton is seeing the Dutch who are over time assimilating as being British, and that they're becoming less and less alien, and they're part of the population, they're part of the British subject. And it's just those weirdos, those teachers who are keeping them, who want to keep their children back, who want to keep the Dutch children back. And to Hamilton, that's not the right way to go, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we're beginning to see an assimilation here, an emergence, perhaps an emergence of something that you might call American culture, although it's not really identified yet, right?
Right, that's right. Yeah. But, and in fact, probably should be even more particularized. They're blending into British New York, at least. It's not America. Yeah. At least in Hamilton's view, what's actually going on in Dutch households, we don't have a window in.
Okay.
Into.
All right.
So in this next passage, would you like to read this, Richard?
Sure. They have very bad water in the city. Now, he's speaking of New York, right?
Right.
Okay. They have very bad water in the city, most of it being hard and brackish. Ever since the Negro conspiracy, certain people have been appointed to sell water in the streets, which they carry on a sledge in great casks, and bring it from the best springs about the city. For it was when the Negroes went for tea water that they held their cabals and consultations, and therefore they have a law now that no Negro shall be seen upon the streets without a lantern after dark.
So why was there water delivery in New York by 1744?
Okay.
Great step forward for public infrastructure.
Yeah, this is a really good quote. I think you could get a lot of mileage out of this in a class. Okay. It amazes me to hear blacks had to have a lantern. For some reason, we buy water today rather than tap water. Okay, it's hard and brackish. Okay, all right. Any other reason why they're selling water in New York? Well, it strikes me that they didn't trust they're afraid of uprisings. They didn't trust the blacks to get together and fetch it from the springs.
That's right. That's right. So there had been, a few years earlier in 1741, there had been rumors that there was going to be a conspiracy by the slaves of New York. It never got any past that, really, and it's not even clear it was even a conspiracy. But it frightened the white people of New York so much that that they started not letting the slaves go to fetch water because they were afraid that the conspiracy had begun when they were going to get water. So they had the water come to them. And in fact, they've made a law, as they refer to now, that no one black in the city could be seen on the streets without a lantern after dark.
And it strikes me here that we have a suggestion of assimilation on the part of the African Americans because they're getting tea water. The Negroes went for tea water. Well, I guess it's the tea water for the people in New York, not necessarily for the blacks. Okay.
That's right. That's right. They're fetching. They used to go fetch water for their masters, and now they aren't allowed.
All right. Okay, I misread that. Okay. All right. Good. Anyone in power fears those they oppress, not just whites. An interesting comment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so the blacks here, the African Americans, would be considered aliens in New York, and they had to be designated as such, particularly at night when they had to carry lanterns. Fair to say? Right,
right. So they are having laws that are made that are quite different for them than for other people in the city.
Okay, well, shall we move ahead then?
Sure. Our next passage comes from Peter Kalm, who was a Scandinavian naturalist. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences sent him to North America in the late 1740s. He published his account on his return. It was translated in several different languages and became quite popular as an account of what was going on in North America. And what we have from him here is really a list of the churches that he sees in New York. English, New Dutch, Old Dutch, Presbyterian, German Lutheran, German Reformed, a French Protestant church, a Quakers Meeting House, and a Jewish synagogue. So what do you think it meant for New York to have such a variety of churches?
Okay. We had some questions earlier about the religious diversity in the colonies, and I think this speaks to it. What do we think about the fact that New York had so many churches in it? Okay, Center for Trade, so you'd have a lot of people coming together for commerce. And,
right.
And it was export trade, so you had, ships coming in with all sorts of different people on them. Dutch opened to different forms of Protestant.
Yeah, that's really important because if the Dutch hadn't allowed various Protestant churches to practice, they wouldn't have had a long history there.
Yeah, this is a good comment here. It's the foundations for the melding of ideologies.
Yeah, that's right. The melding of ideologies and the tolerance of other people's religion. Yeah.
So I'm interested in comment here. No Catholic churches. That's awesome.
Yeah. You don't expect a Jewish synagogue and no Catholic church, but I suspect it was just that the Catholic population was too small for one. I suspect that a Catholic, it's just a guess that a Catholic church might have been okay. But I'm not sure. There certainly was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in New York, even as well as in New England. So,
what about the Irish population at this point? Were there a lot of Irish in New York by this point, or did they come later?
There were quite a few Irish, but most of them were Protestant Irish. The large Irish immigration and the Catholic Irish immigration both come in the 19th century.
Okay. Now to pick up on the question that we had in the form about religious diversity and the questions that have come up in the chat. Could you comment on religious diversity beyond New York? What did it look like in other parts of the colonies?
Well, the middle colonies, New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and the colonies around there, tended to have the freest freedom of religion. So in Philadelphia, I think you would have seen a different mix of churches than this list, but a similarly long list of allowing people to practice a number of different religions as long as they were Christian and perhaps as long as they were Protestant. With the exception here, obviously, of the small Jewish synagogue. In New England, there was a lot less religious tolerance. So people who wanted to practice outside standard Puritanism and the descendants of Puritanism that were accepted in New England were often expelled or simply didn't go there in the first place. So it was some exception of Boston, but certainly once you get beyond Boston. And in the South, it was somewhere in between. There were Moravians and Quakers in most of the southern colonies, but not the diversity that you see in these churches. Now, beyond Christianity, of course, there were African religions practiced, Native American religions practiced, some of which combined aspects of Christianity and some of which didn't. But they don't appear in lists like this by European travelers who tended not to notice them.
And we did have a question here about Muslims, and there were some in the United, of course, very few. Could you just comment on that?
There were, and my guess would be a majority of them were African Muslims,
Right.
And they would not have practiced openly. Right, many African slaves were Muslim, exactly.
Okay.
I mean, and I say openly in that an outside observer could have seen. I'm sure in smaller groups they did.
Okay. Well, why don't we move ahead? And if there are any other questions about religious diversity, we'll bring them in as we move on.
Okay.
So
Great.
we have about a little over 30 minutes, Kathleen.
Okay, that's good to know. What do you think Clark and Franklin would have thought of New York?
Okay. What do we think Clark and Franklin would have thought of New York? When Franklin looked around,
Shocked.
Many people are shocked today. That's quite true. Right, racial and cultural intolerance seemed to be much more outwardly exposed at the time compared to religious intolerance.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah. That's right.
Okay.
Name change.
Yeah, you're right. They would have. It would have been aliens. Franklin's. I tried to warn you. Yep. Yeah, I think that's right. Way too much mixing.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I think Clark. I think Clark might have been a bit more tolerant. Benjamin, on the other hand, these people don't look British to me.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay.
Okay, so to move on to servitude in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The same trends of 1700 to 1770 happened in the middle colonies that you saw all over the colonies. By 1770, there were about 100,000 Germans in the middle colonies, mostly from southwestern Germany. They had suffered French invasions and other civil strife during Queen Anne's War. Farmers and laborers. And they got the name of the Pennsylvania Dutch in Pennsylvania, but this was really just a mangling of the word Deutsch. They called themselves Deutsch, or German, but the non-German speakers around them just turned that into Dutch, so they became known as the Pennsylvania Dutch, but they were actually German. Many came as indentured servants, paying for their passage by signing a contract to labor for someone for a certain number of years, usually 4 or 5 years, in exchange for the price of their passage. Many German immigrants and other immigrants who came to the middle colonies didn't plan to be indentured servants when they left home. But by the time they made it from their home to their port city, before they'd ever left Europe, they usually, many people didn't have enough money left to pay their passage across the Atlantic or to pay their passage back home. So their only choice was to accept passage that was paid for by a ship's captain or a company that ran the ship, and sell their labor as an indenture when they got to one of the ports in North America. Most indentured servants became laborers in Philadelphia or other port towns. Now, Gottlieb Mittelberger came from Germany to Pennsylvania in 1750. He did not have to sell his labor as an indentured servant. He was a musician. He managed to retain enough of his cash to pay for his passage himself, and he taught music for a few years in Pennsylvania. But he got to know a lot of people who did become indentured servants on their arrival in North America, and he didn't like it very much. Here's one of the passages from Gottlieb Mittelberger's journey to Pennsylvania in the year 1750. He says, "When the ships have landed at Philadelphia after their long voyage, those who cannot pay must remain on board the ships till they are purchased and are released from the ships by their purchasers. The sick always fare the worst, for the healthy are naturally preferred and purchased first. And so the sick and wretched must often remain on board in front of the city for 2 or 3 weeks and frequently die, whereas many of them, if he could pay his debt and were permitted to leave the ship immediately, might recover. and remain alive. So why might people find themselves in this situation?
Yeah, why might that happen? Is there any, Kathleen, do we have any sense of a particular place where most of the indentured servants came from, or were they mainly from all over Europe?
Well, there were lots of them coming from Germany and also from the various British Isles, including England itself. And they tended to be people who were pretty bad off, certainly didn't own their land, but weren't the poorest of the poor. The poorest people couldn't have even made their way to a port city usually, although some of them who lived in port cities got swept up and didn't even agree to go to North America. But the people who chose to leave their homes and seek a better life by indenturing themselves, or by planning not to indenture themselves and becoming indentured, tended to come from small towns.
We have a comment here about how the conditions on the servant ships were not much better than the conditions on the slave ships. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things you really sense as you're reading Middleburger. He talks about how people are, he was a little better off because he was able to pay his passage, but people who couldn't pay their passage were really shoved into the holds of ships without being able to come up. And I mean, there are certainly differences from slavery. They, for one thing, had sort of chosen when they weren't in chains, but the conditions on the ship are more similar than you would expect.
We have a question here. Did ship captains allow people on board when leaving Europe, knowing the captains would make money by holding them for payment in the colonies? Was this a business sort of among captains? It's a good question.
Yeah, it was, and a legal business. Yeah.
So they were, in a sense, they weren't slave traders. They were, you could call them indentured servant traders.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Knowing that they were in effect going to sell people when they got to the.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. Well, and what was the standard term for an indenture, or was there a standard term?
It declined a little bit over the course of the colonial period. By this period, it's 4 to 5 years earlier. In the 17th century, it tended to be about 7 years. And that's for an adult. For a child, it could be considerably longer because it was usually until they were 21 rather than a certain number of years.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on then.
Okay, so Middleburger gives this advice. Whoever wishes to earn his bread in a Christian and honest way and cannot earn it in his fatherland otherwise than by the work of his hands, let him do so in his own country and not in America. One of the participants says that, yeah, stay home. Right?
Yeah.
Stay home unless you come to work and can. And even if you can work, you might still be better off staying home, right? Exactly. Yeah, and I think it does happen today. Do the colonies have any form of immigration laws? This is a good question. They really didn't, not until after the revolution.
Yeah, and as one of our participants mentions here, this is a different view of America as a land of opportunity.
That's right. Stay home isn't usually what you think of when you think of America as a land of opportunity. Now, beneath all of this is the fact that some of these people did serve out their indentures, move west and usually south if they were in Pennsylvania, and move into the southern backcountry, acquire their own land, and make a better life for their children. And there is truth too to the story of opportunity in the colonies. And as read Middleburger, we don't see that side of the story, but that's for the people who made it through. They may have made the right choice.
So, when you said they came to the southern backcountry, did most of these folks indeed come to the southern backcountry, or were they pretty well spread out across the south when they moved south?
When they moved south, they mostly went to the southern backcountry. Yeah, they had there would be very little opportunity for them in the coastal parts of the south.
Okay, we have a question here. Early on, weren't Africans indentured and not slaves?
There is some evidence of that, right? And those of you who teach early slavery probably teach about the transition from an early sort of uncertainty about what Africans are bound for, and some belief by some people that they should be let out after a certain number of years, and then an increasing view of Africans as enslaved for life and as their children inheriting slavery. One of the tragedies of American history.
We have another question too. What was the form of advertising most effectively used to promote indentured labor in the European countries? Were Did the colonies advertise for indentured workers?
Yes, yes, they absolutely did. And I don't know as much about in Germany, but I've seen a lot of advertisements that were in England and other parts of Britain. And I guess the most effective form of advertising was just lying. But there were also promises that you would get land when your term was over, which in some colonies was true. That tended to be less true over time. But certainly an exaggeration of the benefits and a downplaying of the risks.
Right, right. We have a question here about free blacks owning slaves. I think some did, but that comes much later, doesn't it? Maybe more in the 19th century.
The examples where we know a lot about them happened later in the 19th century, but you can find that you can find free blacks who owned slaves throughout the colonial period. Not many of them, but isolated examples of them, because that was owning slaves was a route to security and profitability, and unfortunately, and that is something that sometimes free blacks did as well as whites.
Okay. One more question before we move on. Would it be fair to say that Europe was landless? People in Europe, if you didn't own land, the chances that by 1750 of you inheriting land or getting land or buying it were pretty slim, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and land is where freedom, and in the British colonies where the ability to vote and politically participate, all that came from landholding, and the Americas were the place that you might someday own land, whereas in almost all of Europe you probably would never, if your parents didn't.
Okay, well, let's move ahead then. We have about 30 minutes.
Okay, great. Our next passage comes from the case of Maria Christina Martin. Women and children came as indentured servants too. Maria Christina Martin came with her family from Rotterdam to Philadelphia in 1772. Now, rather than read this to you again, I'll just sort of walk you through the math in a moment. But basically, Maria Christina Martin has come to the German Society of Pennsylvania and said she's been cheated. She landed, her ship landed, she knew that they would have to sell some indentures to pay their passage, but her husband died. Her children were sold for more than, and she herself were sold for more than the total of what she believed she owed. But I spent a little time today working through the math, but I think what happened was her littlest children, the 8-year-old and the 4-year-old, probably paid half passage. So I'm just using that figure to try to figure out the math. And that would be 5. That would mean that her family owed passage for 5 full fares, the 2 parents and the 3 older children, and say 2 half fares for the 8-year-old and the 4-year-old. So that's 6 times a fare of 6 guineas, which she gives us here. Plus, she said her husband borrowed 40 guineas before they ever left Rotterdam. And I'm assuming that's money that they had to borrow for their passage to Rotterdam from wherever they were coming from, to the port from wherever they were coming from, and then also probably their upkeep in Rotterdam while they were waiting for the ship to leave. So if I figure it right, she thinks she owed 98 pounds and 14 shillings. A guinea is a shilling, is a pound plus a shilling. So do the math, which I did. 98 pounds, 14 shillings. But she says her children were indentured off for 100 pounds. So she should have paid her whole debt. But now she says she's been forced to be sold for another 22 pounds and 6 shillings. So she's saying to the German Society of Pennsylvania, will you please investigate this because I think I've overpaid. So what do you think happened after this if she went to the German Society of Pennsylvania and laid all this out?
Okay. What might have happened? So this is 1772. I think it's interesting that there was a German society.
Right, yeah.
That she could go to them.
Yeah, founded for things awesome like this.
All right. She wouldn't have a voice. The Germans set up service to protect the rights of indentured servants. The servants also advocated for other immigrants. Right.
So here she is. She's not German, right? She's come from Rotterdam in the Netherlands. But this is and that's why this takes place in English, because she actually doesn't speak German. Mm-hmm. But she sees them as the best advocate for immigrants, right?
Okay. And here, how much interest did the German society have for people of her social class?
Well, that's a great question, because the men who she's speaking to here are doing pretty well. They're certainly of the middling or better class in Philadelphia. But they see it as part of their mission, part of the mission of the German Society of Pennsylvania, to protect people who are more vulnerable than they are. Yes, so Tina says the society would speak with the ship owners, and that's actually what they did. They went and laid her case before them, and they agreed that they did the math themselves too, and agreed that that she'd overpaid and she was free, which I think wouldn't have happened if she hadn't had some fairly elite men go to speak for her. Mm-hmm. Right? Yes, that's right. Did she get her kids back? I don't know, because she really didn't have a case for getting her kids back. Here, whether they came back to her once they were freed, and also whether she was able to live with them, because actually, if you'll notice, the two little ones were indentured to her brother-in-law. So I sort of imagine that at least they're living in the same household after this. So sort of a hopeful reading.
Okay, well, we've got about 20 minutes. So shall we move ahead? Oh, and then we have one question about that. Did she get money compensation back?
Yes, I suspect not.
Okay. And another question here too: what good would a 4-year-old?
Having my own 3- and 7-year-olds, I think I would have to pay somebody else to take them on. But
you're not getting much child labor out of those kids.
No. But I think the idea was that you could train them early on, and they could be. Yes, exactly. There you go.
There you go.
He was indentured until 21. So yeah, you get not so much work out of him at 4 and 5, but eventually you get a lot of work out of him.
Okay, well, let's move ahead. We got about 20 minutes.
Okay, so this next is the last speech, confession, birth, parentage, and education of John Grimes. We've got pictures of a gallows here that's anachronistic, that's from 100 years later than John Grimes was hanged. But I don't think hanging technology changed all that much over the centuries. So we got this nice picture from Fort Smith. John Grimes was hanged in 1765. There was, as we talked about earlier, there was some Irish immigration in the colonial period, and John Grimes was Irish, but it was mostly Protestant. The big Irish immigration would come in the 19th century. But let's let John Grimes give his own introduction to himself. I, John Grimes, aged 22 years, was born in the west of Ireland in a small village of low, poor parents who had neither ability nor opportunity to give me education. So that from my infancy I was brought up to idleness and thieving, which instead of being corrected in me, was rather encouraged. But we could talk about it, what kind of document this is. It's a gallows statement. It has, it's not clear how much accuracy there is in it. But I'd like to sort of skip on quickly to what Franklin would think about Grimes, what kind of alien he was. It's all the parents' fault, yes, exactly.
Okay. Economic conditions of life, Irish Catholic freedom fighter, but I don't know. That's how my wife's family got here. Okay, so what would Franklin have said about Grimes? Okay, can't help who he is, playing to the crowd. These are all questions. Franklin, I told you the type of people who would come.
Yes,
there you go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're all like this. All these immigrants are like this, I think Franklin would say. For the Irish, that's exactly right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a defiance here if he is blaming his parents at the same time. There goes the neighborhood. That's perfect.
That's what Franklin would say.
So I think we probably should move on to the Scots-Irish in South Carolina. So the Scots-Irish or Scotch-Irish were Protestants. The largest group of them were people who had colonized Northern Ireland, who had moved from Scotland to colonize Northern Ireland. But it's a term, the Scots-Irish is a term that's used more generally, I think, for Protestants who came from the British Isles and Ireland, but not from England. But Protestants, not from England, but still British. Most of them were militant Presbyterians. Most of them were farm laborers or tenant farmers. And most of them went, at least initially, to the middle colonies. Now, the southern colonies were growing rapidly in the 18th century, too. Most of their growth was in slaves, but not all of it. Many Scots-Irish and Germans came down, as I mentioned before, to the southern backcountry after they served out their indentures, because that's where the most available land was. Now, the family we'll be talking about here, the Witherspoons, also couldn't afford their passage, but rather than selling their labor as indentured servants, they paid for their passage a bit differently. They were more like homesteaders from later in the 19th century. If they were able to work and improve their land, they would own it themselves and their passage would be paid for. They were sent to the frontier of South Carolina, which, if you think about it, in the 1750s, was the border of Indian nations becoming more and more worried about the expansion of colonies, and on the border of Spanish Florida, which often was at war against Britain. So they put these newcomers out there as a barrier to protect South Carolina and develop the frontier. So here's the account of Robert Witherspoon from his memoir of 1734. Do you want to read this, Richard?
Sure. We were then put on board an open boat with tools and a year's provision and one still mill for each family. They allowed each person over 16 one axe, a broad axe, one narrow hoe. Our provisions consisted of Indian corn, rice, wheat, and flour, beef, pork, rum, and salt. We were much distressed in this part of our passage, as it was the dead of winter and we were exposed to the inclemency of the weather day and night. And what added to the grief of all pious persons on board was the atheistical, blasphemous mouth of our patrons.
So how did the Witherspoon family find themselves in such conditions so far from home? What were the conditions?
Okay. How did they find themselves in that shape? Were they akin to the indentured servants who were escaping but had to rely on the kindness of strangers to get to the New World? Yeah,
that's right. That's right. In some ways, they have a more direct route there, right? They're going straight to the land that if they can survive on it and prosper on it, that they'll own. Whereas indentured servants who went to Philadelphia, if they wanted to own land, it was sort of a two-step process. They had to be a servant, usually in the city first, or a laborer in the city, and then hope to get their own land.
Yeah, and here we have a comment. They seem to have been dropped down a peg or two. Were these people perhaps a little better off in the mother country than they were than the people who became indentured servants?
It's possible. They certainly seem more savvy, right, to have gotten this this deal, and yes, and be able to stay together as a family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how would they manage to get this as opposed to serving out an indenture?
It was probably just timing. They found out that probably these lands were owned by a speculator who was going to charge them a head right, a sort of yearly tax, and would want them to be prosperous because of that, but they would own the land eventually. It was just sort of a deal they were able to find out about that might come and go based on what was available.
It's interesting. They're coming to a rural area as opposed to a city.
Yeah,
Their purpose for coming is different. They're not going to find a job in the city. They're going to actually work the land. In effect, they're going to become tenant farmers for the owner, probably, right?
Yeah, but I think it's an agreement whereby they'll eventually own the land.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, but after doing all the work on it. So should we talk about whether Robert Witherspoon was an alien?
Yeah, sure. What do you think?
Tell us about aliens.
Witherspoon, an alien, Scotch-Irish. He probably was as light as Benjamin Franklin. Would he be considered an alien? What do you think? Clark probably would have welcomed him. Clark probably would have thought he was one of us. But what about Franklin? According to Ben, yes, he was an alien. Red hair might have made him an alien. If he had red hair, sure. Yeah. If he were not English, he would have been an alien. Depends on whose perspective. There you go.
Right, exactly, yes. And this is one that might bend Franklin's perspective. So the Scotch-Irish to him are not white, but this is exactly the kind of thing he wants to see. People moving out to the frontier, improving the land, pushing west. So he might make an exception here.
We had a question earlier about quote unquote hillbillies. When with these people, they were coming to the frontier of South Carolina. That probably wasn't quite the mountains yet, was it?
It's getting pretty close. Well, that's right. This is the 1730s. Yeah, so it's not quite yet, but just pre-revolution and the revolution itself, they are people pushing into the Appalachians and beyond the Appalachians, right?
So you've got hillbillies. You've got people. Baptists and folks who are not part of the Anglican establishments on the coast moving west. And then later on, you've got people coming down the Cumberland Trail and down the mountains that way and forming that culture that became the Appalachian culture.
Yeah, exactly, yes. And as someone hinted with the Risky Rebellion, there's also some movement up farther into the mountains as people try to get away from United States laws. So that's obviously going to be earlier.
Okay. All right.
I'm sorry. I said later.
Okay.
So move on to directly talk. We've talked about Africans and African Americans some so far, but let's move on directly to talk about one. Venture Smith is a man who wrote a rare account of 18th century life, moving from Africa into slavery and to freedom. He's also rare in that he wrote an account about living in New England. The slave population was increasing over the course of the 18th century in New England and the middle colonies as well as it was in the South. It was just moving faster in the South. Venture Smith's account is fairly long, covers his long life. And this is the way he wraps it up. I'll just pause because I'm thinking 60, 69 is feeling less long of a life than I used to think it was. But at the time when Venture Smith was writing at 69 years old, it was a fairly long time to live, particularly when one had been a slave as part of it. So Venture Smith sums up. He says, "I'm now 69 years old. I'm now bowed down with age and hardship. But amidst all my griefs and pains, I have many consolations. Meg, the wife of my youth, whom I married for love and bought for money, is still alive. My freedom is a privilege, which nothing else can equal." Then he goes on to talk about various knaves who've tried to cheat him, which is one of the major themes of his book, how various people have tried to give him trouble. "I'm now possessed of more than 100 acres of land and 3 habitable dwelling houses. It gives me joy to think that I have and that I deserve so good a character, especially for truth and integrity." So how might you compare Smith's life, the life of a slave, and a slave in this case who achieved freedom, to that of indentured servant?
And how does life stack up to what we've heard about indentured servants? You take us through that question? Yeah, Venture Smith's his biography is really interesting. He's been called the Black Benjamin Franklin to some extent, hasn't he?
Yeah, that's right. And he really, I mean, if you look at not Franklin's, the little racist bit that we read here, but the Franklin's, the things he has to say about saving money, about how you can reach prosperity through careful attention to your resources. Venture Smith really does compare with that.
Yeah, he does. He's sort of the flip side of it. Okay, he seems to have reached the American dream. Some benefits labor, although cruelty, he went through a great deal. Okay, yeah, Smith seems to have turned out pretty well. He seems, an indentured servant would be lucky to have achieved what he did, I would think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And yet I think this part where he talks about how he's been cheated by people, you could find indentured servants saying that too. I think a slave trying to buy his own freedom was even more subject to that kind of being taken advantage of than even an indentured servant would have been.
Yeah, we have an interesting comment here. Sounds like Booker T. Washington. I hadn't actually thought of Smith as a precursor of Washington. That's interesting.
I think that's right. Not in sort of the way he advises other people to do. In fact, he has very little advice for other people. It's about how he does it. But I think he's an example of saving and working hard. And I think as Booker T. Washington doesn't sometimes get credit for, but also arguing for being treated fairly, if not equally, in business dealings.
We have a question here. Was this a rare success story, not just for a slave, but for an indentured servant? Would this be rare for anyone who came to this country in conditions less than optimal?
Certainly rare for a slave, and becoming rarer over the course of the colonial period. In fact, I would say those two cases are moving in opposite directions. Indentured servants are becoming more and more likely to eventually improve life for their, I should say, they get more and more likely to survive their indentures and live on to improve their lives. Because the chance of an indentured servant improving their lives if they survive their indentures were actually pretty high. Whereas slaves over the course of the colonial period were becoming less and less likely to be able to buy their own freedom.
Right. Okay. Well, we've got a few minutes. Shall we move ahead then?
Yeah. I think a couple people are also hinting at the more opportunities for slaves in the North than there were in the South, and I think that's becoming true in the 18th century. That's right. So finally, the people who, of all people, certainly can't be called aliens, certainly wouldn't have seen themselves as aliens. Of course, American Indians were here first before any Europeans or Africans were here. Estimates vary widely, but 5 to 10 million Indians probably in North America alone, in what became the United States and Canada before the arrival of Europeans and Africans. Hundreds of different people speaking dozens of different languages. Now, our first passage comes from the Montagnais Indians who lived in what's now the northeastern Canadian coast. And this is an account of their first meeting with the French in the early 1500s. This is a man who's telling it to a French priest. So his grandmother, so a Montagnais Indian grandmother, took pleasure describing the Indians' astonishment when they saw the first French ship arrive. They thought it must be a moving island. They didn't know what to make of the big sails that made it move. Their surprise redoubled when they saw all the men on deck. The women started getting the houses ready, which is what they customarily do when new guests arrive, and 4 Indian canoes risked going out to meet the ship. They invited the Frenchmen to come to their cabins they had prepared for them, but they could not understand each other. The Frenchmen gave them a barrel of hardtack, but when they took it home, they tried it. They didn't like it, and they threw it into the water. So yes, the aliens were the French. That's right. I think somebody asked when the cartoon was. I think it's fairly recent. That in fact, almost every Thanksgiving, the New Yorker or some other magazine puts out a cartoon basically with that theme. That the aliens are actually the Europeans.
Okay, so here now we're looking at it from the other side of the telescope when everybody else is an alien, including Benjamin Franklin.
Right, right. So here they are. They're welcoming the French because they think the French have, in part at least, because they think the French have goods that they want. Although they decide that hardtack is not one of the goods that they want. But also they think the French are weird, right? So they do think the French are alien, even at the same time that they're welcoming them. Nothing worse than guests who overstay their welcome. Hardtack is biscuits that will survive a long time on a ship. So not the best French food.
Unless you put a sauce on it, I suppose.
They'd run out of sauce by then.
Okay. So okay, go ahead, Kathleen.
I want to make sure we have time for Pontiac. So we're going to shift forward another 250 years and inland to the Ohio Valley, when settlers were really putting a lot of pressure onto Indian lands in the Ohio Valley. The French had surrendered the year that Pontiac gave this speech in 1763. And Pontiac is telling people, other Indians, we have to make a stand against the British. We have to keep settlement off our land. So Pontiac was an Ottawa war chief, and he's describing a vision that a prophet, an Indian prophet had, a Delaware prophet had, who was telling in turn what the Master of Life said to him. So who's speaking in this, although it's within Pontiac's speech, it's the Master of Life who's talking to Indians in general, telling Indians what they should do. So he says, the land where you live, I made it for you and not for other people. Why do you put up with the whites on your land? Is it because you can't get along without them? I know that the people you call the children of your great father, so he used the French here. They supply your needs, but if you were not evil, you would do without them, and you could live just as you lived before you met them. Before the people you call your brothers came to these lands, didn't you live by the bow and arrow? You didn't need guns or powder or those other things. Nevertheless, you caught animals to eat and dressed in their skins. But when I saw you giving yourselves to evil, I withdrew the animals into the depths of the forest so that you would need your brothers to supply your needs and clothe yourselves. All you have to do is become good and do what I want, and I will send the animals back for you to live on. So this is an explanation of why things have been seeming to go wrong for Indians for a while, and it's that they have been too influenced by Europeans. That the Montagnais in the earlier passage were wrong, Pontiac is saying, to welcome Europeans. They should have sent them away immediately. Yes, the Creator is speaking through Pontiac, right? Criticizing dependence on the settlers.
Right. What year again was this, Kathleen?
This is 1763, so right at the end of the 7 Years' War.
1763.
Yeah, go back to the old ways and reject the new aliens, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And when the Creator here talks about withdrawing the animals into the depths of the forest, might that be some allusion to overhunting on the part of the fur traders?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. That they've upset the balance.
So now the French have become they're settling in, and now the French are seeing the Native Americans as aliens, but for the Native Americans, they really now do understand what the coming of the aliens meant.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And you know, they lived together on the continent for a couple of hundred years until it came to this crisis point. At least for Indians inland, it reached that crisis point earlier for Indians on the coast.
Yeah, particularly in New England, they were pushed aside much
right.
earlier, right?
Right, and Virginia. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Pontiac and Franklin would seem to have agreed, particularly with regard to the French.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. Although Pontiac hates the English even worse than he hates the French. In this passage, he's trying to persuade them that the French are bad too. He figures his audience is already with him in thinking that the English are bad.
Okay. Now you mentioned that Pontiac hated the English, and my history is, if I remember it correctly, a lot of Native Americans sided with the British in the Revolution. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
How did the other groups? One of our questions in the forum about where did the other groups fall in the Revolution? Quickly, our Scotch-Irish, our French, the Spanish. Well, they probably weren't involved in the Revolution. But where did the Germans and others fall when it came time for the American Revolution to pick sides?
Well, most of the people living who had begun to assimilate, if you will, considered themselves colonists by this point. In fact, the more they considered themselves British colonists, the more they were likely to rebel against the British Empire, join their English colonist comrades, and join the rebellion against the British Empire. So you don't really see much difference in Philadelphia, Boston, places like that, except for African Americans, who were more likely to join the British because the British promised them freedom.
Right, right. And the different, one question here, I think we've pretty well covered how the different groups related to the British and how the British related to them. They just didn't much like each other. But how about the other groups? How did the Germans relate to the Dutch and all the other mix we had in the colonies? Did they get along, or were they pretty well isolated and separate in their enclaves? They
were generally pretty separate. In fact, even different American Indian groups were pretty separate from each other. And one of the things that Pontiac was trying to do was to persuade different American Indian groups that they were a lot like each other. So ethnocentrism was practiced by all kinds of different people, not just the British. Because they tended to write more and be more dominant in the politics of the various colonies, their ethnocentrism is more obvious.
Okay.
I saw one question I'd like to answer real quickly about Mexicans coming. And if we were talking about immigration to the Spanish colonies of New Mexico and Texas and Louisiana, which was Spanish after the 7 Years' War, then quite a few Mexicans did go to those places. In fact, some of those parts became part of Mexico once Mexico separated from Spain. Okay. But there weren't many Spanish speakers. There weren't many Spanish speakers coming to the British colonies.
Okay, we have a comment here about Franklin's attitude toward Indians. Could we go back to the previous slide just before this one, because I think if we could just throw that on the table and talk briefly about Franklin's attitude toward Indians.
So Franklin says here, America is chiefly occupied by Indians who subsist mostly by hunting, which isn't really true. They mostly subsisted by farming, but we'll let them have that. Having large tracts, the Indians were easily prevailed on to part with portions of territory to the newcomers, who did not much interfere with the natives in hunting and furnished them with many things that they wanted. So part of this is right and part of it's not quite right. It is true that there was a lot of trade between the colonists early on through the 18th century and 19th century with Indians. But the easily prevailed on to part with portions of their territory obviously is a little more contentious than it says. Nice revisionism, as one of the participants says, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And we see this plays itself out later on in the 19th century, when one of the excuses for moving Indians out of the East Coast was that they weren't really farming the lands, they were hunting and nomadic, and we can put it to better use. So you begin, I think, to see the beginning of that ideology here with Franklin.
That's exactly right, and it goes back earlier than that too, right? Sort of not being able to see Indians as farmers because it's very convenient not to see them as farmers.
Right. Okay, then, so we come back to our forum questions. I think we've pretty well covered what we've got here.
Right. We were talking about the revolution. I didn't talk about the Southern backcountry, where people really split, and there were a lot of Scotch-Irish of various kinds on both sides fighting against each other in militias, which would make its own hour and a half class.
Okay. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've gone a little bit over time, so let's wrap things up. Have we addressed your questions? Any closing comments or questions before we shut down for the evening? I don't see anything coming through, so why don't we go ahead and do that. Please, ladies and gentlemen, use the forum to continue your discussion, to share fresh approaches and discussion questions that work with your classes. We'll monitor the forum until October 28th. If anything interesting comes across there, that we'll pass that on to Kathleen, and we'll be back in touch with you. Please submit your evaluations and request a poster. It's free. Did we mention, by the way, that it's free? Anyway, it's really a great poster. I think it would make a great addition to your classroom. So let me thank you, Kathleen, for giving us an excellent seminar this evening. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you all. And I'm going to go back and read everybody's comments again, because I know I missed a lot of them.
Okay, and I want to thank our participants for their intelligent and enthusiastic participation this evening. I hope you'll join us again for some more seminars. We have a really good schedule remaining for the fall. Check our website, because we'll soon be putting up our spring schedule, and I think you'll see some great titles there. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you once again, and to tell you how to escape your classroom. Up in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the word File. Click on that. There'll be a drop-down menu, and you'll see Exit Session. Click on that, and you're home free. Thanks again. Hope you'll be back with us again soon. Good evening.